Yeah, thanks so much, Sarah. And it's really a pleasure to be here with you all. Sarah didn't mention it, but I'm a new resident in Tacoma. So this is a great opportunity for me to build community with you all. So I really encourage you to engage in any ways that you see fit. You're welcome to comment through the questions and answers, or feel free to ask a question whenever something comes to mind. Then you're also welcome to contact me at the end. I'll share my email and a link to our webpage. So today I'm going to talk about a new program that we're launching called Forest Health Watch, and we're really in the early stages, but it's quite an exciting time to share with you. And so we welcome any kind of feedback and form of participation at this time. And we'll get into this a little bit. To build off of what Sarah was acknowledging, our research is based at the Puyallup Research and Extension Center in Puyallup, which is just a little bit east of us in Tacoma. And as Sarah was saying, it's really important to acknowledge that we're on the ancestral and sacred lands of many indigenous communities. And so there's this really incredible tool called nativeland.ca, where you can browse kind of where you're home and look at traditional territories that that you're essentially occupying now and sharing. And so we specifically acknowledge the Puyallup tribe of Indians because we're actively learning, researching, exploring research and ideas around tree health on these traditional lands. And so we just want to take a moment to acknowledge kind of the historical legacy that we're a part of here in Puyallup and Tacoma. I also want to acknowledge that my position and my role at Washington State University is entirely supported by the USDA through a fellowship provided by the National Institute of Food and Ag. So we just want to give them some credit. So today I am going to speak to you about some of those forest health issues and some things to look out for in our neighborhoods, in our yards. And before I do that, I kind of want to put urban forests in kind of within the lens of the discussion today. So this kind of outline what we'll discuss. We'll first talk about urban forest health, and then we'll talk about this concept of biosecurity, and then talk about some factors that affect tree health and things to watch out for. And then I'll introduce this Forest Health Watch program and how you all can participate if you would like to. So in terms of urban forests, there's a lot of literature and a lot of up and coming literature about how urban forests are important. This is a link to this pretty amazing article that summarizes some of the kind of the co-benefits of having trees in our cities and our urban environments. For example, reduced noise might not be something that we think about with urban forests, but trees are helping reduce the noise in our streets. There's research that's linked it to student attention in classrooms. We know that trees help improve air quality. They reduce heat island effects, which is pretty critical. I think a recent study led by the city in Tacoma demonstrated that there's 10-degree variability across the city. So depending on where you are, you might be 10 degrees hotter than another part of the city. That is pretty incredible. And that is really a factor of the urban forest and the trees that we're benefiting and the trees and the benefits that they're providing us. So I just wanted to highlight forests and urban forests and their importance in our lives, especially here in Tacoma. You know, these benefits are limited based on the health of the tree. For example, in this photo, this healthy Douglas fir is probably providing more services than say an unhealthy Douglas fir, or in this case, this unhealthy Western red cedar, right? So essentially the healthier the forest, the more services they're providing to us. And so healthy forests are really linked to healthy communities. And so what's at risk? You know, what do we need to watch out for? Well, we need to maintain the health of our forests in these urban systems if we want to maintain the benefits. And so that is really all I'm going to say about urban forests at this time. And now I'll move kind of in this direction of biosecurity. So now I was going to shift towards this concept of biosecurity, and generally what we're talking about is the management or the monitoring and the resources that we're dedicating towards keeping our biotic or our natural resources secure, right? So in this kind of diagram, we can imagine that if you have a limited amount of funding, you can only invest in certain stages of an invasive species introduction. And so by invasive species, I'm referring to an organism that's from another country that has the potential, or another area of the world that has the potential to do harm in our system. So we can invest in preventing it from arriving. We can invest in detecting it once it's arrived. So spend all our money in having people survey trees in the city, or we can spend money in preventing it from arriving by maybe increasing legislation that says this kind of product cannot be introduced to this country without this and this quarantine, or this and this form of inspection. Those are the examples of prevention. Once a species is introduced and been detected, then we can invest in eradicating that species and trying to control it. If that doesn't work, then we have to focus on containing that species to prevent it from spreading to other places. And once it's kind of beyond our control, then we might want to shift our investments to mitigating the impacts, or alleviating, reducing the effects that these organisms are having. And then finally, if all hope is lost and we are just forced to accept this organism or this invasive species in our environment, then we can start funding or putting our money in restoring the system. And so slowly going out and maybe pulling out the blackberries, for example, or removing Scotch broom or some of these invasive plants. So this is kind of the progress of how an invasive species affects our system and where we have opportunities to invest money. In Tacoma, we're especially kind of at the forefront of where we can invest these opportunities. And that's because we have this enormous port of Tacoma, where we have containers full of material frequently coming in. And because of this, it's important to monitor for the arrival of new invasive species, but also ensure that we're doing what we can to control these pathways. So in terms of forest health, there's a couple major pathways that affect that introduce organisms which compromise the health of trees. And so this is largely, say, pathogens like microorganisms that cause disease, are what we consider pathogens. And these pathogens are frequently introduced through the trade of live plants. And so that may be one pathway that they're introduced to Tacoma. Another pathway is through containers, or by accidentally hitchhiking on wood material or other materials that are brought within the international trade. So now I'm just going to give you a couple examples of invasive species that have been introduced through these pathways. And one is this disease called sudden oak death. It's not a major problem to us locally, but in California, it's associated with the death of millions of tan oak trees. And this is really an issue caused by a microorganism, which we call Phytophthora. And it's just a group of microbes that are easily spread within the trade of plants. And this is kind of a neat story because it was first found by a landowner who noticed their trees were dying. And then they contacted a university professional who confirmed that, who was kind of the first to find this organism or this disease. And so in California, we're really seeing the entire change of a lot of these forest systems on the coast because of the accidental introduction of this species. So this is just an example of a kind of a terrible invasive forest pathogen in this case. Now, if we also look at the Washington Invasive Species Council website, there's numerous priority pests is what they call them. So these are pests to keep an eye out. So I was just going to highlight a couple. So the first is emerald ash borer, which has really devastated forests in a lot of urban systems on the east coast of the US. And we're still actively watching for it to arrive in Washington because we don't want it to affect our local ash species. So keep your eye out. And if you see an emerald ash borer, a species that looks like this, you can contact either me or the members of the Washington Invasive Species Council. Another species is the Asian longhorn beetle. And we have a couple local species that are native that look similar, but there are distinctions, and that information is also available on this Washington Invasive Species Council website. So both this species, in contrast, I guess, to the emerald ash borer, which affects mostly ash species, this species can affect many different trees. I think it's known to affect more than 40 different species. Another example of an invasive forest pest that we're concerned with is this Japanese lanternfly, spotted lanternfly, excuse me. This spotted lanternfly has been detected in Portland, and we're concerned about it moving into Washington, although the detection in Portland was actually a dead specimen, so they're not sure if it's there yet. But keep your eye out. If you see a fly, a kind of beautiful looking insect like this, encourage you to report it to the Invasive Species Council. Another example is the gypsy moth. This one it has been introduced to Washington on numerous occasions, and the state actively manages and controls this pest because it can have substantial effects, where essentially its larval stage, the caterpillar, if you will, defoliates a lot of species, and it can cause major issues with common species such as Douglas fir in our forests. So those are just some examples of invasive species that are important to keep an eye out for. So now I wanted to highlight a couple things that we can do ourselves, kind of with this biosecurity lens. So in a way, we could consider it backyard biosecurity. And so one thing that we can do is ensure that we're either buying or we're promoting and planting native species. And really, we just emphasize that because we assume that they're produced locally. But if you're really keen to produce ornamental or to plant ornamental species, you please do your best to ensure that they're actually grown locally. And rather than buying your plants from a big box store that may have shipped the material from another part of the U.S., try and find local producers. Another thing that we encourage in terms of biosecurity is to support clean nurseries and to find productions that are trusted and do a good job managing disease and preventing the spread of disease in their system. So, for example, in this photo on the bottom, if you notice that the plants are just sitting in soil and there's big pools of water, that might not be the best way to prevent the spread of organisms. And so I'd rather encourage you to support a system or a production that gets the plants off the ground, where the plants aren't a potential risk of spreading organisms. You might also see these amazing boot cleaning stations when you go to parks or local trails. I encourage you to use these. These are important. Generally, it's not going to wipe a microbe off your boot, but it will remove the soil that could contain microbes. And so by doing things like this, we can essentially contain and prevent the spread of microbes or hitchhikers, if you will, into new environments. So that last photo was a picture of a boot watching station in Australia that I visited, but this is a more local example where this one's in Whatcom County. I'm not sure if we have any examples of this in Pierce County, but it's definitely something to consider investing in if we aren't already. And in case you want to find more resources, these are pretty phenomenal kind of public outreach campaigns. One is the Play Clean Go campaign, which essentially is emphasizing these boot cleaning stations and washing your tires and things like that. There's also don't pack a pest, which really emphasizes what you should and should not take abroad on airlines and things like that. Then the don't move firewood campaign is pretty important. Firewood, whether you're taking your recreational vehicle or just going camping for the weekend, try not to take firewood from say the West Coast to another state or vice versa. That ends up being how a lot of these wood boring beetles like the emerald ash borer or the Asian longhorn beetle are spread is through firewood that people are driving across the country because they want to have firewood when they camp. But generally, this is part of the reason why campsites tend to try to sell firewood at their campsites. So that was all I was going to emphasize for some local biosecurity information. I see that Jenny made a comment that Washington State has had introductions of the gypsy moth, but WSDA eradicated every introduction. So the state is really active in controlling gypsy moth, which because it's such a potential risk for many of our natural resources. And that's incredible. And we're really lucky to have support for the state, but it's still, they would still benefit from having more eyes on the ground, for example, or if there's more people out there helping them look. Not every program is perfect. If you see something like that, let them know so we can kind of remove it quickly. Thanks, Jenny, for sharing that comment. In terms of keeping trees healthy, there's a couple ways to think about this. And the disease triangle is something that's commonly referred to in our field of forest health. And essentially, the way we think about this is inside the triangle, you have disease or you have an infection when conditions are appropriate or when conditions are right. So for example, we might, in terms of the host, you have to have the right plant in the right place to have a disease. You also have to have the right temperature or the right amount of precipitation for that disease to occur. And then if it's a disease we're talking about, you have to have that microbe present as well, or the microorganism that causes the disease, the pathogen. And so when you have all three of those things together, then you may have disease. Same goes with insect pests. If you have the insect pest there, it has to have the right host or the right tree species for it to feed on, essentially. And you have to have the right environmental conditions. And the reason I wanted to bring this up is because it's a nice concept for when you're thinking about changes in the system, right? So for example, if we are faced with changes in the environment, such as longer growing seasons and increased drought, we may see new diseases emerge or new infections emerge or more disorders or injuries, if you will. So for example, I'm going to speak about this in a little while as well, but there's this consensus that the Western red cedar throughout the region is declining because of increased drought and because of increased growing seasons, and just generally the species having a difficult time acclimating to those conditions. So you may see some Western red cedar with tops dying in your neighborhoods or your communities. And if you do, please let us know, because that's part of a different research project that I'll talk about. But that's just an example of kind of the environment changing to create a disease or disorder or an issue. Other things that can happen is we have a new pest or pathogen introduced, or we change the host species, we replant different species, and then we introduce them to an area where there's a pest and pathogen and an environment just waiting for that appropriate host to arrive. So in terms of forest health and in terms of thinking about the health of a tree, there's a couple of different things to look for. One is the signs that something may be going on. In this case, it could be an actual mushroom caused by, produced by a root rot pathogen, for example. So that's an example of a sign of something that's affecting the health of a tree. But then we also have the symptoms. And so in this case, the symptom may be just wilting, right? So this is like the common cold symptoms where you have a runny nose but it's actually, there's a lot of different things that could be causing that runny nose, right? So generally, I'm going to go over a couple signs and a couple symptoms to keep an eye out. First, we can start with the signs. So I already mentioned mushrooms. So in this case, this is an armillaria mushroom. And in the same photo, this other photo is also armillaria, where you have these mycelial mats. And so these are both characteristics that you might see if there's armillaria present. And armillaria is a pretty important root rot pathogen in the region. And so if you see this or this, it's generally an indicator that there's armillaria in that site. And the trouble with armillaria is it's considered a generalist because it can infect so many different species. So it'll be difficult to grow any woody species or most woody species in that site if you have armillaria. However, there are some species that are more resistant. One of those being western red cedar. However, you know, with the combination of warmer, drier conditions and armillaria, it may not, western red cedar may not be favored, as in this picture. This is another example of a sign. So this is Phlinus warei. It's another root rot pathogen that produces a mushroom. And in this case, it's on a spruce, I think. And so this pathogen, when you see this mushroom, it kind of looks like a cow pie. Some people refer to it as the cow pie fungus. If you see this on your tree, it's a sign that there could be root rot occurring on that tree. So these are just examples of signs. Other signs might include these kind of galleries that we see produced by, in this case, a bark beetle. So bark beetles are small insects that don't necessarily, they bore into the bark, but they don't bore into the wood of the tree. Excuse me. And they produce these galleries. Let me see. And so within these galleries, you basically have the parent boring into the bark. This is actually an imprint on the wood after removing the bark. So it's not the best example, I apologize. But basically you have a parent who lays a lot of eggs through this main chamber. And then when these eggs hatch, the larvae actually bore outwards. And based on the pattern of the gallery, you can determine what species of bark beetle you have. So this is an example of a sign of an infestation that might be associated with the health of your tree. Another sign might be this material which we call frass. Excuse me for a second. So in this case, we have a wood-boring insect that's bored into the tree or the bark, and it's created these holes. And often we see kind of the residue, the excrement of the beetle produced, and that's what we call frass. And so this frass is something to keep an eye out on your tree. If you see a tree is unhealthy and you see there's frass there, it's an indicator that there's insects boring in or inhabiting the bark. Similar to frass, we also have these noodles, and this is the same thing. It's excrement. It's essentially digested cellulose that those beetles are produced. And so sometimes you might see these kind of noodles coming out of a tree, and that's another indicator or another sign that there's an insect pest involved in the health of that tree. And then, of course, you might find all three present together. And so in this case, we have fungal activity, we have armillaria, we also have wood borers, and we have bark beetles. And so teasing out kind of the order that these are occurring is quite difficult, but generally a lot of these organisms are considered secondary, or they kind of wait until the tree is stressed by another factor before they'll actually attack or before they can overcome the defenses of the tree. So in some cases, there's an interaction of all of these, including climate, right? If we think back to the disease triangle. Now I'm just going to highlight a few symptoms. Some of these might be kind of obvious, but maybe not. So one symptom that we're seeing with Western red cedar commonly is this thinning of the canopy. So for example, this picture of a Western red cedar in Point Defiance Park, very, very thin canopy compared to, say, these trees in the background. That's a good indicator that it's a good symptom that something is going on. Wilting is also a clear symptom. You know, if you see a plant that's wilting, our first response is, oh, it doesn't have enough water. But then if you continue to give it water, or if you notice that water is not really helping it, then that's a good indicator that something else is going on. There might be a root rot pathogen, or there could be something else that's kind of girdling the ability of that plant to transport water. This is called Gamosis, where we see this kind of tree start to produce these exudates. In some cases, it's the first defense a tree has to push out the beetle. This photo didn't turn out too great. The beetle is out of focus, but you might notice here there's a tiny little bark beetle that this tree has successfully defended itself by using Gamosis to produce, to kind of defend or push the beetle out from boring in. But essentially, if you see these, sometimes we call these pitch tubes or this Gamosis on a tree, it's an indicator that something is affecting its cambial tissues. Down here, sometimes it can be more subtle initially, but there are things to keep an eye out. Generally, dieback, branch tip dieback is another good symptom to keep an eye out for. In some cases, it can be pretty severe, like in this madrone stand in Point Defiance Park, or this madrone tree on this. You know, in some cases, this is just a symptom of being surrounded by pavement and maybe extra compaction on their fine roots that prevents them from being able to send enough water all the way to the tip of every branch. But there are other, you know, this could be a symptom of many other things like root rot, or again, a bark or wood borer. Branch flagging, or just generally these dieback of individual branches is a good indicator that something's going on. Sometimes we see trees just kind of shed individual limbs before they completely collapse. And I wanted to include this other photo, you know, to keep this mindset. Even though we're focusing mostly on the urban environment, it's good to think of our neighborhoods as forests. And so you might be wondering why your pine tree is dying, or your tree is dying, without acknowledging that your neighbor's tree is also dying. You know, it says a lot of times with invasive species, it doesn't really matter what one person does on the side of the fence. Generally, we all need to work together. Otherwise, we're going to all feel the impacts of these organisms. So that's why I like to include this picture, because essentially what's going on with this pine is also going on with the pine next to it. And in that case, it was a wood borer in a park in Seattle. So I see there's a question from Bonnie, which is a great question. She's asking, why are there Western hemlocks dying? And I'm interested to hear more about your observations there, Bonnie, because I haven't heard of that occurring that much in Tacoma and kind of this lower Pierce County region, but I have heard of more hemlocks dying in Whatcom counties and in the North Cascades. Sometimes in connection with this Hemlock Looper, which is an insect, a defoliating moth, I think. But you're right, there is something going on with the hemlocks that's causing a lot of people to scratch our heads, but it just seems like a really complex issue, and we need more support and more research to really figure it out. So at this time, I don't really have an answer. But maybe that should be a project that we focus on with the Forest Health Watch. You know, I think that even within the Forest Health Watch program, there's a lot of opportunity to partner more with DNR, WSDA, and then that's some things we've done. So I'm grateful that you've taken the time to join us and emphasize that the more eyes out there watching, the better. So we encourage you to visit our website. It's foresthealth.org. And again, it's still in the early phases, but there are a lot of opportunities to get involved. So generally, this is a community science program where anyone can participate, anyone can be a community scientist. And there's opportunities to contribute to research, but there's also opportunities to just share observations or engage more with the broader community. So within that web page and within our website, you'll find a place to sign up as a community scientist. However, you don't have to sign up to participate. It's just there if you want to be more directly contacted. We also have a newsletter. There's some resources that we're working on providing for other members of the community. We have a listserv where you can join the listserv and email other people that are interested in forest health. For example, if you're an arborist and you have a question about the health of a tree, there might be another arborist on the listserv at some point that has an answer to that. So you don't have to rely on the state or me or whoever else as heavily. There should be some community there. There's also space to report health questions. Like if you want to share pictures of an unhealthy plant, I will do my best to find solutions or answers, or put you in touch with people that will have those answers. We can also link you to labs that actually process samples and do diagnostics. We also have a section where we're calling calls to action. It's essentially our blog where when a new arrival of an insect or a disease occurs and becomes an issue or concern for the state, then we'll post something there. So it's like, watch out for this. We also, if there's a researcher that was looking for help with collecting some information or collecting seeds for, say, the ash, then we'll post it there. And then finally, we have space about our research projects. And at this time, we just have one research project, and it's about this Western red cedar dieback that we're seeing. So I'm just going to spend a couple of minutes talking about Western red cedar. Western red cedar is a really important species to the Northwest, ecologically, culturally, and even economically. And unfortunately, we're seeing a lot of dieback in the region. And so I encourage you to keep your eye out for this. If you see a Western red cedar that's thinning or completely dead, or you might just see the top dying back on that cedar, we want to know, because then essentially if we know where it is, we can start to piece together and look for patterns that explain why it's occurring and what areas are vulnerable. So we're not the only ones to notice. There's a lot of news articles, particularly out of British Columbia, where Western red cedar is actually their provincial tree. So in Washington, our state tree is Western hemlock, but in BC, it's Western red cedar. So in some cases, it's considered an emergency what's going on, especially in the urban environment where we're seeing a lot of Western red cedar dying. And so there's some major concern there, and we really need help to understand why this is occurring. So we've created a project on Inaturalist. Inaturalist is a smartphone application where you can share observations of any organism. But in this case, if you search for Western red cedar, you can see there's a lot of other observations of Western red cedar in the region. So this is around Mount Rainier. So although it's a smartphone application, you can also just use it through your computer and your browser. And so we encourage you to check out this application. Essentially, you can add an observation of anything, and the community will help you identify what it is. They also have computer algorithms that try and give you suggestions for what it is based on the picture. Then within the Inaturalist app, we've created a project called the Western red cedar dieback map. And this one's kind of outdated, but it's just to illustrate. You can add an observation to Inaturalist, and then it asks you if you want to add it to a project. And you say yes, and I want to add it to this Western red cedar dieback map. And so we're looking for both healthy and unhealthy Western red cedar so that our models in the end can have that data where trees are healthy and then where they're unhealthy. And then we can start to find these patterns that explain why they're unhealthy in those areas or what those areas have that might predispose them to being less healthy. So yeah, we encourage you to check out this Western red cedar dieback map. As in the last slide, there's more information about it if you go to foresthealth.org/map. And just to emphasize what we're after, generally, if we can map where we're seeing healthy and unhealthy trees, we can start to identify the characteristics with those sites. So, is it in a floodplain or is it on the top of a hill? Is it in an area that's urban or is it in an area that's rural? Those kind of characteristics we can piece together and look for patterns. But then we can also use that to start identifying important environmental parameters. Is precipitation more important or is temperature more important? Those kind of questions are what we're after generally. And with that information, we can really start to predict where vulnerable areas are going to be and where those areas need help. And with that, we can start to look for genotypes or other seed sources that might be better fit for those vulnerable areas. So that's kind of the big scheme on how you can really help science go faster in a lot of ways. So together as community scientists, we can keep trees healthy, not just by reporting Western red cedar observations, but also by sharing observations of unhealthy plants generally. You might be the first to report a new invasive insect, for example. And the more eyes, as Jenny said, well, the more eyes we have out there looking and observing, the quicker we'll detect changes and be able to control those changes. So I really encourage you to engage with us in the Forest Health Watch program, where there should be more resources and opportunities to participate. And yeah, you're welcome to contact me directly via my email here or through the website at any time.